So we're going to begin to explore the causes of the Civil War. And today we're going to explore from an economic perspective some tensions that existed between or within the United States between different sections of the country. So today's topic is sectionalism and the market revolution. So we wanted to be able to define both of these things, but not only that, we want to be able to explain the relationship between them and also how they might be both contributing ultimately to the Civil War. So let's go. First of all, what is sectionalism? And feel free to fill this in on your little graphic organizer. Well, in this picture, you kind of see the United States of America broken up into different sections. Sectionalism just means that the people living in those specific areas are giving primary loyalty to a state or a region rather than to the nation as a whole. So you come to see yourself as a Southerner or a Northerner or a Westerner rather than as an American. And sectionalism is a huge issue in U.S. history prior to the Civil War. The Civil War will ultimately unite Americans as one nation. But prior to the war, there's competing influences. Certainly, sometimes people see themselves as Americans, but there's also certain loyalties to their regions that are kind of pulling them apart. So, what's the cause of sectionalism and why is it happening? Well, the primary cause is economics. So America is a very diverse country, not because of the diverse climates in large part in the country, the diverse geography, and the economies of the different regions vary. So sectionalism is very much rooted in just economic differences, because what's good for the industrial economy in the North might not be good for the agricultural, slave-driven economy of the South. Seems pretty simple. Okay, but why is sectionalism occurring in this era that we're looking at before the Civil War, in particularly, the 1820s and 1830s? Well, there is an event called, or a movement called the Market Revolution, and you want to know the definition of it, so here it is. The Market Revolution is improvements that occur in transportation alongside the rise of new inventions. That these two things team up to bring radical change to the 19th century economy. And what that radical change is going to be, each region is going to specialize in a particular economic area, and you'll see that momentarily. So what the effects of these new technologies and new transportation, here's what happens. Well, because you have new technologies, in particular, we're going to look at a lot of them, but in particular, you're going to see the rise of industry, of mechanization. Well, this is going to mean that you have more production, so farmers can produce more. You can begin to have factories producing textiles instead of people hand sewing. Well, because people had more than what they can consume or more than they needed because of this machinery, they began to sell their items in a national market. So you would sell your item beyond just your town. You might sell it to someone on the other side of the country, if not the world. Now, what's allowing you to sell these things from far and wide? It's not just the fact that you can produce more, but it's because there's new transportation methods. It's because shipping costs are being drastically reduced because of this new transportation. That's allowing people to sell goods in a national market, which is why we get the term the market revolution. Now, the biggest effect of both these new technologies and these new transportation improvements, like we mentioned, is that each different region of the country begins to specialize in a particular economic area. So in the Northeast, it becomes the industrial sector of America. The South becomes devoted to plantation agriculture, where cotton is grown and slave labor is used intensively. And in the West, the West becomes the nation's breadbasket. In other words, grain, wheat, farm goods that are going to be consumed. These are the products that are produced in the West. So in many ways, the West is going to help to feed the North. The Southern cotton is going to help to feed northern factories, and northern factories are going to supply the South and the West with these new machinery, the new machines that they need. So all three areas of the country are technically becoming very connected in terms of trading with each other. But there's also going to be tension because, like we said, what's good for an industrial economy is not necessarily good for a slave economy. What's good for an economy based on the production of grain might not be the same as an economy based on the use of slave labor and the production of cotton. So there's going to be this tension between these different regions of the country that's going to exist. So we'll explore that momentarily. But for now, let's take a look at some of the transportation improvements that existed that helped to drive the market revolution. And one is actually in our backyard in Middleport. Well, first big one, you begin to see the development of turnpikes. A turnpike's just a fancy name for a road. And this was designed because roads back then, they didn't have pavement. What these turnpikes oftentimes were just logs that were placed in rows. And it was a lot safer for wagons to go over it because obviously they wouldn't have to go into ruts and risk breaking wagon wheels. So it was certainly a primitive form of transportation, but the construction of turnpikes and dedicated roads, almost like the highways of the 19th century, helped to speed up transportation. Here's an example of a road, and this one's very important because it goes from Baltimore, a port city, all the way into St. Louis, which is along the Mississippi River. And in the process, it crosses a very important mountain range, which was a very big barrier for trade, and that's the Appalachians. So in western Virginia, parts of Ohio, this mountain range technically could divide the western part of the United States from the eastern part. But this road helped to pave a way through it so that trade could happen between eastern areas and western areas. And then there's the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal is going to make New York State one of the greatest states and most wealthiest states in the country. The Erie Canal takes advantage of a gap in the Appalachian Mountains. So the Appalachian Mountains don't run through upstate New York. They kind of take a sharp cut to the right when you hit Pennsylvania, and they go through the Catskills in the eastern part of New York. But the Erie Canal connects the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River with the Atlantic Ocean. So this is an incredibly important ditch that exists because it allows farmers in the West to easily transport their grains to markets in the East. And it makes Buffalo in the process one of America's booming cities. And you can see the route of the canal, and you can see how other towns in New York wanted to connect to the Erie Canal. And then it's not just the Erie Canal, there's going to be a canal building frenzy throughout America as different areas, different Western farmers, people in the East want to obviously tap into this transportation network so that they can ship their products to market and to places far, far away from their home. Then there's the steamboat. The steamboat was so important because for the first time ever, and it was invented by Robert Fulton, for the first time ever, the steamboat allowed transportation to go against the current. So you could sail both up and downstream. Prior to this, you had to go with the current or simply go with whatever way the wind blew. So the steamboat helps to change that, and it helps to make transportation occur in both directions, meaning it's going to drop the price, obviously. And then there's also clipper ships. Clipper ships have a specific kind of hull that actually helps them to cut through the water faster, so it cuts down the time that a ship would be sailing across the sea. So again, it speeds up transportation, and if it speeds it up, it's going to reduce the cost as well. So the final transportation improvement we'll talk about then is the one that's actually going to render a lot of these other forms obsolete, and that's the railroad. Now, we're going to talk about the railroads in a couple months when we do a unit on economic history. But the railroads begin to emerge during the market revolution. But they are not very reliable. They're rather primitive. They reach a top speed of 8 miles per hour, which completely gives people motion sickness. So the railroads are beginning to develop, but they're certainly not the dominant form of transportation yet. They will be in the future, but not yet. And you can see by 1850, though, how the railroads are expanding across America, primarily in the north, where there's a lot of urban areas in the north, a lot of factories that need to be connected with other cities, and the raw materials from different parts of the country. So the north tends to have a much more diverse railroad network than the south does. In the south, they don't necessarily need railroads as much. They simply, the south has a very good river system that allows farmers to float their cotton down to different ports like New Orleans or Charleston or Savannah. And you can see in this graph just the result of all these transportation improvements and what they do to the price of shipping freight. And then finally, it's not just transportation, it's also communication. Because what's the point of traveling far if you can't communicate as fast? So in 1840, Samuel Morse, this is where the word Morse code comes from, invents the telegraph, which allows instantaneous communication. So this is the 19th century version of the text message. And then Cyrus Field is going to invent the transatlantic cable, which is actually a cable running through the ocean all the way to England and allows people to communicate almost instantaneously from one side of the world to the other. So those are the transportation improvements. Now, that's obviously every region of the country is going to benefit from that. Now, let's take a look at how each different region of the country is developing and how certain inventions in different parts of the country help that region to specialize in a particular economic area. So let's start with the industrial Northeast. The Northeast, the first factory comes to America through a guy named Samuel Slater. He's considered the father of the factory system. He smuggles out blueprints of a factory system in England and brings it to America. However, there's a caveat. He does this by doing it in his head. He memorizes the blueprints because to get caught smuggling documents of the English factory system is a crime punishable by death, because the English don't want people to be able to compete with them, so they're trying to keep their factory model a secret from the rest of the world. Slater sets up a factory in Rhode Island, and what he actually does is he sets it up along a river. And the reason for this is because the river he's going to use hydropower and a water wheel to power the machines that are in his factory. So he sets up the first factory in America. Now, most factories, though, would not have existed without a man named Eli Whitney, who's going to come up with the idea of interchangeable or standardized parts. And all this is he takes a machine and he makes sure that all the parts for one machine are the same as all the parts of another machine. So if potentially one machine breaks, you can take a part from another machine. And what Eli Whitney does is he takes 10 different muskets, guns, to the White House, and he has standardized the muskets. So instead of having 10 different gun makers make 10 different guns, because the gun makers might not all follow the same pattern, he wants a machinery to make these guns, and he takes 10 guns to the White House. He disassembles them all in front of Thomas Jefferson, places all the parts, mixes them all up, and then reassembles 10 different guns. So the whole point of interchangeable parts is that it's more efficient, obviously. So if a machine breaks, you can easily replace the part, and whatever good is being produced on the machine, same concept, you're using the same pattern over and over and over again. It just promotes economic efficiency. So his invention is very helpful to getting the factory system off the ground. And then we have Elias Howe and Isaac Singer, who come up with the sewing machine. So prior to the sewing machine, women would have to sew by hand. But now with this machine, all you simply do is you turn a wheel or step on a pedal, and the needle will automatically go up and down, and sewing becomes incredibly, incredibly fast. This is obviously going to reduce the price of clothing, and it's going to create a demand for cotton. And you could see the effects of the sewing machine, where all these new textile mills, all these new factories prop up around New England. And it becomes kind of the industrial area of the country. And you can see, if you compare it to the South to kind of emphasize the idea of regional specialization, New England dominates this industry of the textiles. In the South, you have a few factories, but you can see just based on the color code that they're very, very small. The vast majority of them are in New England and the Northeast. And so during the market revolution, you could see now the rise of factories. So no longer is the work done in the home. It's done in a factory, in a centralized location, and you're working on kind of an assembly line. So one person's not making the whole shirt. It's simply being done by machines at various points along the process. And so workers kind of lose a little bit of the control over it because the machines are doing most of the work for them. And because of the switch to factory work, people are going to begin to live near factories. And the work is not going to be as spread out as it used to be. When it was done in the home, it didn't matter where you lived. But if it's done in the factory is in a centralized location. So now people are going to flock to these areas. So during this time period in the market revolution, the Northeast becomes more and more industrial and also more and more urban. So there's a direct correlation between industrialization and urbanization. Contrast that with the South, which really can only claim one major city, New Orleans. And even New Orleans, it's a port city. That's why it's so important. But in the industrial North, you can see significantly more urbanization. And this is only 1820. By 1850, you can really see the explosion in the Northeast of urbanization. Now let's take a look at the South. Now, the South, ironically, was slavery almost died in the South after the American Revolution. And in part, it was because it was becoming unprofitable. When you're paying for a person for their life, you're buying a person for life, that's a really expensive investment to make. And the cash crop at the time, tobacco, was not earning the planters a lot of money, and they were having trouble paying off their debt from buying the slaves. Well, this all changed when a northerner named Eli Whitney, after watching a slave use a comb, began to come up with an idea for how to separate cotton, the cotton fiber, from the cotton seed. Prior to this, it had been done by hand, and it was an incredibly slow, painful process, and as a result, cotton, it was very, very expensive to buy, so very few people used it. Well, Eli Whitney comes up with the cotton gin, which all it really is, it's simply a giant comb in a machine which you crank. You put cotton and you put the cotton into kind of the chamber, and you crank it, and the machine will pull the seed through a comb, and it'll separate the fiber from the seed very quickly and very efficiently. So what this does is this makes cotton incredibly cheap and therefore incredibly in demand. So there's going to be a cotton explosion across the South. And with the explosion of cotton is going to become the explosion of slavery. So slavery is going to spread throughout the South. You can see kind of where the cotton belt is by looking for the darker areas of red. Those would be very high cotton producing areas. And the South is obviously going to become solidly a slave society. It's going to be pretty much based, their entire economy is going to be based on the production of cotton. They're going to kind of walk down a dangerous path and become a one-crop economy, which isn't necessarily a good thing, but it definitely made them rich in the meantime. And now let's turn to the West. The West is the nation's breadbasket, so there's been some improvements in farming, which is allowing farmers in the West to produce significantly more crops with less work. And so grain production soars. One big thing is the steel plow. So John Deere, yes, the guy who obviously lends his name to the tractors, John Deere invents a steel plow. Now, the benefit of a steel plow is that it cuts through soil significantly easier and deeper than does a wooden plow, which can obviously break. So the steel plow, when it first came out, people were so skeptical of using it because they thought it was actually going to poison the ground. The metal was going to poison the ground. But the steel plow allows farmers to plant land, to plow land that in the past could not have been plowed because it was too hard, it didn't seem fertile. But now with the steel plow, you can really cut through that land a lot better. In addition to the steel plow, there's also the mechanical reaper invented by Cyrus McCormick. What this allows you to do is to obviously mow down a field very, very easily and collect the wheat. So rather than go through the field with a scythe in your hand and cut everything by hand, the McCormick reaper, you simply hitch your reaper, and you can see some Amish folk doing it in this picture, hitch your reaper to a group of horses and simply go through the field, and the reaper will spin and accordingly cut down and bunch up various bushels of wheat. So this allows grain production to soar. And the grain is going to be sold not just in the West, but in the North, in the South, and even throughout the world. And now finally, so we've talked about the transportation improvements, we've talked about the new inventions, and we talked about how each region is economically speaking specializing in a different area. Well, because of that specialization, there's going to be debates and tension over government policy. Because like we said, what's good for an industrial economy is not necessarily good for an agricultural economy. So let's take a look at some of these issues. On just the general question of how powerful the national government should be. So we've seen in the early republic that the national government is increasing its power using the elastic clause, doing things like creating a national bank, potentially increasing its power to regulate interstate commerce. So how do the different sections feel about this issue? Well, the Northeast very much favors a strong national government. They think that the national government will help businesses by creating things like a national bank, by investing in transportation improvements, by placing taxes on imported goods to try to protect northern factories. The South prefers a limited or a small or weak national government. And there's a reason. The North is growing in population, due in part to immigration. Immigrants are attracted to these northern factories. And if the North is growing in population, that means that they're exercising more influence in the national government. And the South, therefore, is experiencing less influence in the national government. So why would they want a government to grow more powerful if they have less influence in it? And in the West is kind of divided on this. In some areas, they want a strong national government, but in others, they do not. And we'll explore that as we go through this list. So let's take a specific issue, like Hamilton's financial plan. So remember, part of Hamilton's plan was to create a national bank using the elastic clause. So how is this going to divide the country? Well, the Northeast is going to be strongly in favor of a national bank. They want the government to create a bank that will be able to lend money to finance factories. A factory is really expensive to get started. No one person has the money to start a factory. You're going to need to take out a loan. You're going to need some capital or some money to start up your factory, and the national bank can do this. The South is very much opposed to Hamilton's financial plan. They think that a national bank concentrates a lot of the country's money in the North, and it really favors industry over agriculture. Agriculture doesn't necessarily require, at that time, a lot of loans to get started. So the Southerners are very skeptical about the existence of a bank. They think it truly exists to kind of take their tax money and concentrate it in the North. And the West is identical to the South on this one. So they're strongly opposed to the national bank. As an agricultural region of the country, they don't see a bank as being in their self-interest. Then there is something called the American system. The American system is a plan that a congressman named Henry Clay comes up with that says the national government will spend tax money to build roads, bridges, and canals to connect the different regions of the country. Well, the Northeast is strongly in favor of this plan. The transportation improvements, like the canals, the railroads, the bridges, etc., are going to help transport raw materials and manufactured goods. So they're going to get the raw materials to the factories, they're going to get the grain to cities, they're going to get the cotton to the cities and the factories, and the manufactured goods that are produced can then be sold to the West and the South for a very cheap shipping rate. The South, however, is strongly opposed to it. The South does not need an elaborate system of transportation. They don't have a lot of cities, so there's no necessarily need to connect them. They are a very rural society, and cotton is relatively easily transported on rivers, which, and this is geography, all flow to different port cities like New Orleans or Savannah or Charleston. Furthermore, they don't want to have to pay taxes to the national government that are going to be used to fund transportation improvements that are primarily in the North. So, why would the South want to help out the North if it's not going to benefit the Southern economy? And the West is very similar to the North on this one. They're strongly in favor. Remember, the West is kind of isolated by the Appalachian Mountains. It divides the country in many ways. And so you need these transportation networks to help Western farmers get their grains to the market and to get access to northern manufactured goods. Protective tariffs, another issue. A tariff is a tax on imported goods. It helps to protect the nation's factories from foreign competition by making those foreign goods more expensive. And as a result, the money that's collected is going to go to the national government. Well, the Northeast, very much in favor. It's going to protect northern factories from foreign competition. And then the money that's going to go to the government is going to be used, the Northeast hopes, to fund transportation improvements. The South, however, strongly opposed. They don't have any industry in the South, which means that they have to buy all of their manufactured goods. Well, the Southerners would rather buy cheap foreign-made goods rather than expensive American-made ones. And furthermore, they don't want to see their tax dollars go to a government that is increasingly controlled by northern business interests because, again, the population of the North is growing. More population equals more votes in the House of Representatives. And on the tariff, the West is very much divided. They like to see the idea, they like the idea of tax money being collected and being used for transportation improvements, but they're also a little nervous that a tariff on British goods, for instance, could cause Britain to tax American agricultural goods in retaliation, which is obviously what the West produces. So very much divided on that issue. And then final issue, the extension of slavery. Slavery, of course, we know this is going to be a huge cause of the Civil War. Slavery is becoming an issue already during the market revolution. So should slavery be allowed to expand into the Western territories? The Northeast is very much opposed to the expansion of slavery. The Northeast believes that free labor is superior to slave labor. And wherever slavery goes, cotton goes with it, which means that industrialization does not. And the North is very much afraid that if the Western territory becomes slave territory, then the South will gain more power in the national government, and they're going to pass policies that are not friendly to industry. So there wouldn't be a bank, there wouldn't be a tariff, there wouldn't be any internal improvements. So the North is very suspicious of Southern motivations here. And the South, conversely, is suspicious of Northern motivations. So if slavery does not spread, only free states will exist in the West. And this is going to give the North more power in the national government, and they could potentially abolish slavery entirely. And certainly they're going to get more votes in Congress, and they're going to pass policies that are very friendly to an industrial economy. So the West kind of becomes, in many ways, a battleground between North and South to extend their version of their economic vision to the West to try to solidify their own interests. And the West here, we can't really say what the West feels about this because we're talking about slavery going into the West. They don't necessarily get an opinion. It's the North and the South imposing their vision or their will on that region of the country. So in summary, to bring this to a close, after this lecture, you should hopefully know the following things. What was sectionalism? What was the market revolution? How does the market revolution cause sectionalism? And then all those debates we just looked at, what evidence of sectionalism do we see in the political debates of the early 19th century? So the different stances on the tariffs, the national government's power, the national bank, the American system, and the extension of slavery. This is in many ways dividing the country based on their economic specialization. So with that, good night and good luck.